on. All right. Hello, my name is Jennifer Young, and I am the metadata coordinator at Northwestern University Libraries. My pronouns are she, her, and I am talking to you today about changing the subject. Thinking globally, acting locally is my cheeky way of describing what my talk is going to be about. Changing the subject is also a name of a short documentary that talks about the process that Dartmouth proposed for changing the subject of illegal aliens to something that is not illegal aliens, because humans are not illegal. And which got the involvement of actual Congress in it. And it's a very fascinating documentary if you want to. It's freely available if you search for it. But what I am going to be talking about today, yes, so there will be a little bit of just a brief content warning of violence and racism in what I'm talking about. But here's the situation. Meadow is our repository, which is awesome. All of our access points have URIs because we love linked data. So all names and subjects have to have a URI in our system, which led to the creation of a local authorities module, if you will, in Meadow, so we can make sure that things that are not in the vocabularies that we already use, we can add those locally. And this is also tying into a effort that the libraries in general are putting together to sort of address systemic bias in our metadata historically and currently. So I've also linked to a GitHub repo where for our Northwestern University's local authorities, which is mostly based on ALMA and what we were doing there, but it lists the subject headings that we are initially starting with. So we are starting with slaves and slave narratives and all those related headings. There's a whole list if you go to the GitHub repo. So we want to change things from slaves to enslaved persons. So in Meadow, if I do a subject for a slave, there's 6 headings for that. This is our local authorities dashboard. You can see that you have the label, which is what displays to the public. The hint, which I've been kind of using a sort of what project this is part of, sort of like Afri posters, or we have Curtis collection, which is Native Americans and things like that. And then you could see the ID is the URI that gets minted for these materials, for these headings. So also thinking about language. So we have these West African manuscripts that in ALMA records have keywords that are in Arabic, but then also like the ethics guidance. And those were created by members of those communities. So we wanted to make sure we retain them, but we also wanted to have URIs for these things. So it's another way of addressing that locality that we want to maintain. So here's a little interface of it. It's really simple. It's just whatever I want the label to be, and then any hint. I don't have to have a hint, but I'm using it. And then this is after I create it, and you'll see down at the bottom, you have fugitive enslaved persons, and then fugitive slaves, and then the URI that is minted there. And you'll see like these, the other fugitive slaves, they're from our migration, which just happened earlier this year, where we just sort of minted everything locally, and then we're going through the cleaning up and actually making them proper headings, if you will. So let's see. All right, so here's the little video of a process. I looked up fugitive slaves. There's 7 works. So now I'm going to batch edit, and it really is this fast. I have to say, it's amazing. I love it. So now I'm saying I want to remove the fugitive slaves heading, and now I'm going to select the local heading. So I'm selecting Northwestern University Libraries Local Authority as our controlled vocabulary, typing in fugitive, and it pulls up the heading I want. I go boom, boom, boom. And then I have to go back up to the top. I don't have to give it a batch nickname. I did just so I remember what I'm doing. Then I understand because this could be destructive. And then I have the little batch edit dashboard, and I did pause, but it did take about less than a minute for it to complete. And now I can click on that and it shows me everything that's in that batch. So, and then I can look to verify that what I did was the fugitive slaves is now fugitive enslaved persons. So this is the process that we can use to sort of remediate or address those reparative practices that we want to enable in our systems. And, oops. And that is my talk. So thank you. Feel free to reach out with any questions. And I don't remember who Heather said was going next.
That would be me. Okay. Can you see my slideshow or can you see my face or both?
Both. Looks great.
Great. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Drew Myers. I work for the GBH Educational Foundation, formerly known as the WGBH Educational Foundation, but we dropped the W for excellent reasons that our marketing department will no doubt tell you about. So this is sort of an add-on to the Developer Support and Engagement Working Group presentation. One of their goals was to identify challenges of developer participation. And in the slides, anything that's underlined is a link. So their findings were compiled in a Google Doc that is linked here, appropriately called Challenges for Developer Participation in Samvera Code Implementation. And inside of that document, you will find a discussion on the challenges for what they called one-off contributions. And they defined one-off contributions as creating a PR that addresses a single issue outside the scope of a larger effort. Plugin-y like things. And it was suggested in that same document that a lack of plugin architecture might be preventing some plugin-like contributions that may be helpful for others. And then someone said, wasn't there a plugins working group? And yes, there was. And I facilitated that, and some of you here were probably a part of it. And so Maria Whitaker reached out to me and asked if any of that work might be able to be carried forward within the context of the efforts of the development, I forget the name of it, Development Support and Engagement Working Group, which, by the way, I'm not a member of, I should state that. But it was because of the overlap of what they were talking about in this working group and previous work from the other working group that Maria reached out to me and asked if I could give a lightning talk on this. And so I agreed, and I concluded after reviewing some of the deliverables that we had of that working group that maybe some of it. Really quickly, the Samvera plugins working group produced a set of guidelines for plugin development. There was additional aims to try to actually write a real plugin that adhered to these guidelines, but due to capacity limitations that I'm sure we are all familiar with, that part did not happen. But the guidelines are still available in the Samvera Labs GitHub organization. They were not widely adopted. They didn't get a whole lot of traction. In retrospect, I would have to say that plugin was very loosely defined. And so being able to provide specific guidance on how to really interface with Hyrax was really hard because there was lots of different places to interface with Hyrax. And at the time, the folds in the code weren't particularly suited for all kinds of plugin work. So we reported on our findings, we had these guidelines, and then we ended the working group. After the fact, back when we still had our W in our name, WGBH and IU collaborated on a batch ingest plugin, which is also still available in Samvera Labs. And we're actually using it in one of our apps, so please nobody delete it. And in developing that plugin, we basically tried to adhere to our guidelines, and we succeeded somewhat. I attribute a lot of that success of, folding smoothly into Hyrax, basically due to the fact that this particular plugin just kind of stayed out of Hyrax's way. So it might be a useful example in showing how to write a Rails engine that doesn't step on Hyrax and doesn't allow Hyrax to step on it. But other than that, as an example of how to write plugins moving forward, I'd say that it's fairly limited. Now, while we were creating this plugin, there were a few other batch ingest efforts underway. And one of them eventually became Bulkrax. And at this time, it has much wider adoption, and it is much more mature. And I think Rob gave a presentation on it earlier, Rob Kaufman, and said that it's all but ready to come out of Samvera Labs. It's ready to go. So I would say that moving forward, exploring the patterns that Bulkrax has used, which has a similar concept to the one that we developed, looking at some of those patterns and how it interfaces with Hyrax would be a good step forward. And it's the patterns that I kind of wanted to focus on here. From the experience of going through the plugins working group, I was thinking maybe a plugin architecture is not the best term to use. And part of that is due to the very nature that, a plugin may be large, it may be small, it may touch the front end, it may touch the data model. There are a lot of different places where it may interact with Hyrax, and its scope may vary widely. So the concept of having some sort of central plugin architecture into which all manner of plugin could be plugged, that's a heavy lift, right? So I think a better approach would be to ensure that Hyrax has nice folds in the code that cater to good plugin patterns. And that brings me to the Hyrax Event Bus, which is a pattern that has been, it replaced the old Hyrax callbacks system and is a much better model. In fact, the Hyrax callbacks, I think, are deprecated in version 3 and are slated for removal in version 4. There was a comment in the document that the developer engagement working group, they were asking about the callbacks and whether or not they just hadn't been publicized enough to the community. The answer is they're going away. So use the event bus instead. It's a lot better. And it follows a pub sub model that is based on the dry events library, where someone, Hyrax defines a set of events, and then as Hyrax goes through its stuff, through its life cycles and stuff, it will publish data to these events. And then you can plug your custom code in to subscribe to those events, basically listening for when they happen, receive that data that Hyrax gives you, and then carry on your custom code. And as far as examples go, I was looking in the Hyrax code, and I found 11 event listeners at least that are doing stuff following this model. So to call them plugins, I don't think is exactly right. However, they behave in a similar way that a plugin could behave. So in my mind, I think that this is just a great pattern. If the goal here is to basically come up with a refreshed set of tutorials, guidelines, examples on how people can make smaller contributions, one-off contributions, so to speak, to Hyrax, putting forward some examples following this model, I think is a great step forward. And so that's basically my presentation. Thanks. Any questions, you can hit me up at my email here, or I'm on Samvera Slack at AFRIT. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I can't wait to see what comes from this discussion coming back up. All right, next up, we have the Indiana University Collections folks. I think Adam and Daniel.
Hello. Yes, I'm Daniel Pierce. I'm here with Adam Ploshay. We're both developers at Indiana University Libraries. we work on, among other things, a project called Digital Collections. Digital Collections is a Hyrax application that we're intending to use to replace a wide variety of our legacy applications, ranging from Pages Online, which was based on Princeton's old Plum application that later they rewrote to become Figgy. And that houses some pretty large musical scores in the range of several hundred pages. And we're also intending to use this to migrate some pretty old Fedora 3 backed image repositories as well. And yeah, sorry. Jim also helped out on this, Jim Halliday. We soft launched digital collections, but we've only really imported a small amount of data into it. So there's a lot of work ahead for us. To help us along with that, we are using Bulkrax, as Drew gave us a great introduction to. And as Drew also said, Rob gave a great presentation on Bulkrax. We're using it mainly with the CSV parser, as well as a slightly customized XML parser that we use for METs. We are also using the AllinsonFlex gem, named for Julie Allinson. This provides what we call flexible metadata support. As you can read there, AllinsonFlex is a gem that lets you dynamically edit the machine-readable metadata modeling, the M3 schema, to modify work types, contexts, which are admin-specific display characteristics, mappings, and properties while the application is up and running. We worked with Notch 8 to make this. They made this great graphic, I believe, for last year's Connect. I can't remember exactly. Gives a pretty good overview of how it works. If we zoom in on the middle part there, then we can see kind of the general overview of what's involved here. There's a versioned metadata profile that you can create and associate with work types, and then that can be associated with collections in the form of what we call a context. And then through that, we can go in and change the specific metadata properties that are visible on those work types and when you're looking at it as part of certain collections. It's not been a completely smooth road, especially integrating the two. And Adam's going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've done to make those two work together and just some of the other issues we've run across while doing digital collections.
Hello, yes. So the first thing that we ran into is that after AllinsonFlex was working in the interface, we found that when we ran ingest via Bulkrax, and also another process we used to pull metadata from the card catalog, and both processes were dropping all of the flexible profile fields. And it turns out that's just because those weren't in jobs and they hadn't spun up and initialized AllinsonFlex. So, that was actually pretty easy to fix. And once we had that change in place, those were working. The next thing we looked at was the metadata profile version varying over time and being able to specify which version we wanted in case a CSV had been built for an earlier version of it. And then finally, once we had all this metadata, we realized we didn't always want to show all of it. So Daniel, if we look at the next slide, we can see this is from the development environment. And at one point, we had accumulated 22 different versions of profile. And the next slide, you can see at different points in time, I had made objects manually. And when you make something, it uses the newest version of the profile that's currently available. So the next slide shows I've made a couple of works. One was version 15, and one was 22. And if you go in to edit something, then at that time you have the you can update it to the newer version. But we didn't want to run into the issues that could crop up if you had built something for ingest to an earlier spec and it maybe changed. So the next slide shows we made some changes to the Bulkrax importer so we could specify a version of the profile, which defaults to the newest one. But you can specify one for the CSV. You can also specify it object by object, but generally you're going to want the batch import to all be for the same version. So yeah, that's the profile stuff. Can you advance, Daniel? Yeah, here's an object that I made up on my system that's not actually a picture of Princess Street West. But you can see there's a lot of information showing in the catalog that we don't necessarily want to display generally. There's some sort of more system-related backend fields like the date uploaded timestamp, workflow status, OCR status. And then we've got some more normal metadata, but it's possible we want to hide something, like maybe we want the creator to not show up in the public view. So in the Bulkrax profile editor for each individual property, you can tweak a whole lot of things. There's quite a lot of detail available, but the next slide shows in the indexing properties, we added a new option. So making something stored searchable makes it show up in the catalog. Facetable makes it a facet. We also added this admin only flag. And when that's in place, it's still indexed according to what those two values chosen above, but doesn't necessarily show up to everyone. So I think the next slide is again showing when I'm logged in the upper right corner as a Ploshay at IU/EDU. I'm seeing all this stuff. But if I'm not logged in, then the creator facet, which was second down from the top, disappears, and the creator field disappears, along with several other of the ones we're hiding that are, again, more back-end stuff, like timestamps and workflow status. So yeah, those are the three kind of main categories of changes we needed to make, which I guess brings us to the wrap up. Or Daniel, you want to take it back?
Sure. So going forward, we'd really like to work more on AllinsonFlex. We're trying to potentially become kind of the leadership for that gem. We definitely want to send some of the fixes and improvements we've seen from digital collection, get them merged into the gem. Should be easy since it's in Samvera labs. Hopefully we might also optimize on the performance. It is pretty chatty when it's looking up the various parts of the dynamic schema. Yeah, we'd like to see some other people making use of it and potentially even getting it integrated into core Hyrax so we can avoid developers having to edit all 17 or so files just to add one measly little metadata field. So those are kind of our goals. We'd love to have some help with it. Notch8 has been great working on it. Yeah, so thanks for listening. There's some links to our repositories, to digital collections, and our email addresses. We're all on Slack, of course. And yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you both so much. All right, our next lightning talk is from James Griffin.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So hello, everyone. My name is James Griffin, and I am a digital infrastructure developer with the Princeton University Library. And for this lightning talk, I'm going to be providing a brief overview of a current project that we are developing, branded Oranos, and it addresses automating the deployment of Ruby on Rails applications with Capistrano to server environments. So very briefly, Oranos is a deployment management platform. It's implemented using the Ruby on Rails framework. It itself is a Rails application. And it was actually originally developed as an Atmos, as a project branded as Heaven, managed under the username Atmos on GitHub. The rebranding included just using the reference to the Greek god of the heavens, Oranos, from Greek mythology. And if one takes a look on GitHub, I can go into a bit more detail. Heaven itself, just as a warning, has been archived. So this really needs to be sort of maintained as a live fork. The architecture for Oranos is basically that it sits between any development environment and server environments in which one is going to readily deploy a Rails application and utilizes the GitHub Deployment API. It utilizes a number of different deployment strategies in order to basically manage the deployment of different GitHub projects. And we currently use a single strategy within the Princeton University Library, one based off of Capistrano, which basically uses SSH in order to log into and clone the Ruby on Rails source code for any given project. However, there are more complex deployment strategies that are supported upstream that we've been looking to port. One is based off of Heroku, the cloud service provider, and also Fabric, a framework implemented in Python actually for working at a low level with server environments. So in order to provide a better visual representation of what I've just tried to outline, this is from the GitHub documentation. Essentially, Oranos is basically the application that interfaces directly with the GitHub API and manages the deployment events and deployment status updates here. So essentially, this is represented. Oranos fills this gap, the third-party column, if you will, within this swim lane diagram. Essentially, the tooling here, which is something that exists independently of Oranos itself, and GitHub is actually what manages the individual deployments of a given project by managing these events and statuses between GitHub and Oranos as the third party. Where Capistrano is actually situated within this workflow is that Oranos, in response to receiving notifications from GitHub, uses Capistrano over SSH in order to deploy and use git clone to actually ensure that the Rails application is accessible and ready for access on a given server. Now, the GitHub Deployment API itself, what lies within this lane, is basically just a web API over the HTTP for tracking individual project deployments. It's fairly message-driven in the sense that the API will receive, say, an HTTP request to create a deployment. So the tooling here, this could be anything. It's like a curl request or any sort of GET request or a post request, my apologies, a post request to create a deployment on the API will be received by GitHub. GitHub internally will note that a deployment for a given project has been created, and then a webhook notification will be issued in response to whatever services happen to be listening on either end of this. In order to basically ensure that you now know as a consumer that GitHub has is ready to deploy your project and ready for you to basically hand everything off to Oranos. So webhooks are pretty heavily utilized in this, and I didn't want to basically go too far into detail into this for the purposes of keeping this presentation within the scope of a lightning talk, but it should be noted that within the GitHub docs, which I've linked to in the slides, there's a pretty fair amount of documentation regarding what you can expect from the GitHub API when it comes to managing the webhook deployment events. So one can see here that one receives basically a JSON payload that could be parsed. And within this payload, you have access to, say, not just the URL for an individual deployment that's been created, but you can specify the environment in which the application is being deployed, the user associated with the deployment, and quite a bit of metadata about the deployment itself. Now, I've made reference to this tooling column within this diagram, and essentially these types of tools that are used in order to create deployments are actually separate from Oranos, and typically it varies a bit depending upon what your team supports. But one project that's used internally within the Princeton University Library is Hubot, which is basically a generalization of a GitHub internal chatbot that's used to manage application deployments from within Slack. And basically, for our team, we have available a dedicated channel, which allows a user, say myself, to come in. We branded this pull bot, give it an instruction to deploy a given application, as well as an individual branch name to, say, the staging environment. And the bot itself has some interaction where it basically indicates that it's received this message, and then it basically provides two updates indicating that the deployment has been created and the status of the deployment. So as one can see here, that's primarily what the Hubot branded as Pullbot is doing within this swim lane, is basically ensuring that one can readily actually create the deployments and receive, update the status of the deployment within Slack. Branding for this is typically referenced using the term portmanteau chat ops, chat operations. Also, as a brief aside, the server environments into which one deploys your application using Oranos, or really with the GitHub Deployment API, on the whole, it's entirely unopinionated. So we at Princeton internally use Ansible, but if one happens to be using some other configuration management solution, that again is really lies outside of the scope of this service. Right now, very unfortunately, Heaven has been archived for some number of years now. So the hope is that while the project at Princeton is going to have thorough support for working with deployment using Capistrano and some better support for using Hubot, I think that it's mostly complete with that regard. There's always the possibility that if Oranos might be helpful outside of the context of Rails applications, it need only be integrated with an application that uses Capistrano for deployment. So I mean, other Ruby frameworks such as Sinatra could just as easily be used as Rails, as was the case with the original Heaven project, there's also the possibility of looking to support other providers such as Heroku or Fabric, which basically would allow one to kind of interact with platform as a service providers. One could also possibly think of maybe some sort of like a container-based approach, where one could, given that Heroku's platform as a service style architecture is slowly being deprecated in favor of containerization. Perhaps that's another provider that we could look to support in the distant future. So as this is evolving, I would please welcome any and all questions and comments at jrg5@princeton.edu. I'm also available at jrgriffin II in the Slack channel. And thank you very much, everyone, for your attention and interest.
Thanks so much, James. All right, our next lightning talk is from Brendan.
Hi, I hope everybody can see and hear me okay. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yeah,
Great.
Looks great.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Brendan Quinn. I'm a senior developer at Northwestern University Libraries. I go by he and him, and my talk today is about using mocks in our Elixir application ecosystem. I go by he and him pronouns, and I'll also probably be saying we a lot. And by we, I mean myself, Michael Klein, and Karen Shaw, who gave presentations yesterday. So that's our backend dev team at Northwestern. So mocks, what is a mock? What do I mean when I say mock? So this ancient blog post from 2015, the creator of Elixir, his name is Jose Valim, said, the Wikipedia definition is excellent. Mocks are simulated entities that mimic the behavior of real entities in controlled ways. I always consider mock to be a noun, never a verb. And that sort of struck a chord, I think, with the Elixir community and created a lot of discussion about what does Jose mean by a mock is a noun, not a verb. Like a mock, in this context, how I like to think of it is that a mock is something in your system, not something your system does. So I'll sort of go over a few examples of how we use mocks in our applications and talk about some of the goals and alternatives as fast as possible. So the goals, our first goal is just to gain confidence in code that calls external APIs that we don't control, especially in our test suite. So we want to make sure our code does what we think it does. And so we write tests to do that, and we write mocks to make better tests. We want to avoid making external API HTTP requests while running our tests. Like this is the old, like I want to be able to run my test suite from the airplane or the train without an internet connection thing. We want our tests to be easier to write. And to quote Trey from a few minutes ago, we're not talking about magic today. So what we want to avoid is like fiddly tests where you're overriding function return values, like kind of, I used to do that all the time in my Ruby and RSpec days. So what we want to do here is just write code that lives inside of modules that's easy to understand and read and use and also configure. So I have 3 examples ordered by complexity, even though that's kind of a lie because one of them became more complex over time. So we have these three bullet points here are all modules in our application. One is a media convert mock, one is an Authoritex mock, and the other is a mock server we use for minting arcs. So in order, so the media convert mock came around because we use AWS Elemental Media Convert to transcode audio and video files. And we have a whole bunch of development infrastructure for simulating the AWS environment locally using Docker and Meadow and things like that to simulate S3 and SQS and all these different tools that AWS provides. But we don't have the ability to simulate media convert transcoding. It's a pretty complex process, and there's no like off-the-shelf tool out there that can mimic that. So we wrote a media convert mock that we use in both development and test environments. And the mock simulates responses from creating jobs via the media convert HTTP API, which is basically what you do is you create a JSON template and you ship it off via the HTTP API to media convert, and media convert spits back a response. It's basically like, we're doing a thing or you didn't send the right thing. And so that will create or not create a job and send you a return value. So our initial implementation, this was basically the whole thing. I stripped out comments, but this is it. It's basically 2 public functions, configure and create job. And it was, the only complication here is we wanted a way to be able to simulate failure. So the happy path is just returning OK and a fake job ID. And the sad path is if you put the string error somewhere in the file name in your test, it'll return an error tuple. So that was just a way to get us going with our ingestion pipeline, which sort of goes through steps of processing files for ingest. And one of those is send off the thing to media convert. So this allowed us to iterate quickly on that piece of the pipeline. And so that's the job. It's just a function in a module, just like everything in Elixir is really just modules and functions if you drill down far enough. So sorry about the small text here, but you can kind of see what Jose was talking about how a mock is a noun, not a verb. You can see over here on line 44, we're calling media convert client, which is a private function down here at the bottom. And all that does is pull out of the configuration the module that we want to use to call the create job function. So in production and staging environments, we use the real media convert module. And in development and test, we use this mock module, and they both define a create job function. And one does a real thing, sending an HTTP request to AWS, and the mock has these sort of canned responses that, as you can see on my next slide, got more complicated over time. So I'll give everybody a minute to read through those lines of code on the left there. Just kidding. That's just a way to show how this mock module got more complex over time. So now it does things like copy files to a streaming bucket, so we can do sort of a simulated version of streaming locally. And then we added this transcode complete action later on because the asynchronous nature of media convert. So you send off the job, and then later on the job will be updated with statuses. And then our final step in the processing pipeline is this transcode complete action. So our mock sort of just got more complex over time. And the good thing is we didn't have to change how the code was configured or used within the action. It all works the same way. It just does more now. The second example I wanted to talk about is the Authoritex mock. So really briefly, we've given talks about this before, but Authoritex is an Elixir library we wrote for searching and fetching controlled vocabulary terms inspired by questioning authority. So we needed a way to populate works with controlled vocabulary terms in our test suite. So we wrote a mock. It was also really helpful during our migration from our Hyrax repository to Meadow because the works already existed and they had controlled vocabulary terms. So we used the mock to flesh out those works in our migration test that we wrote. So there's sort of 2 sides to this one. It's sort of getting a little bit more complex. On the library side, we wrote the Authoritex mock module that implements the behavior that all the Authoritex modules provides, which is search and fetch functions. And then the mock does a couple of extra things that the other ones don't do, which is initialize an Erlang term storage in memory cache. That's just provided by the Elixir ecosystem. It's just like Redis or Memcached. It's an in-memory data store. And it also adds a few functions to get and set data in that cache. And then on the application side, we call Authoritex mock init to, in our test helper, before the test suite runs, it starts the ETS cache for the Authoritex mock. And then you configure the Authoritex mock, just like all the other Authoritex modules that you use. This one's for our test environment. We only use a couple. We don't use LOC or any of the other Authoritex libraries. And then we provide defaults using a thing called an XUnit case, which just allows us to share these mock records amongst our whole test suite. So I'll show really quickly what that looks like. And sorry again for the small font here, but you can see in yellow, it says describe tag authority file and a file path to a JSON. And then on the right here, you can see what that looks like. So that is just a pretty simple JSON file. It can be as short or long as you want, but so this is specifically these records that were part of the migration, and we wanted to test the full functionality of migrating records over to our system. And so this one was overriding the defaults, which are kind of just like mock 1, test 1, that kind of not real quote unquote data. So here we have a test that overrides the default to add custom authority records for a specific test. And then the last example I wanted to show was our Meadow Utils Arc client mock server. And this one is by far the most complex version. We use the EasyID API to mint Arc identifiers for our works in Meadow. And we wanted a way to do that in development and test without hitting the Arc API. So the mock server here is an actual web server that's running locally. It uses the Cowboy web server and something called Plug, which in Elixir land is kind of like Rack plus Sinatra. It gives you kind of a routing layer for your web server. So this is running as a child process in our application supervision tree, and it only runs in the development and test environments, not in production. So any process can send messages to the mock server, and this gives us asynchronous test support as well. So we can mint arcs in our test suite in an asynchronous way, which is really nice. So you can see here a little bit of the configuration. At the top here, we have default arc config URL. This is the real EasyID endpoint. But in our development and test environments, the URL is the localhost web server that we're running that is responsible for creating arcs in the mock server. So that's how it's configured. It's just like a little configuration block. And then the client code that makes the requests, this is our Arc client. It just calls get and post and put in like a nice HTTP wrapper API. So the client will use one URL in one environment and the real URL in the production environment, and you don't have to change anything about the calling code in order to do drastically different things. So we went with a DIY approach, but you don't have to. There's a whole bunch of mock libraries out there for Elixir. Mocks is one that came out of that initial blog post that I mentioned on the first slide, but there are several others. And the last one I'd like to point out, XBCR, is one that we actually use in Authoritex to record HTTP requests for all the different Authoritex modules, because there's some pretty complex stuff happening on the HTTP side there that would be really hard to mock. So we record cassettes for those things, just like in Ruby, VCR, same kind of thing. So that's all I had. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brendan. All right, our final lightning talk comes from Chris.
Okay, can you see my screen and hear me?
Yes.
Great. My name is Chris Colvard. I use he, him pronouns, and I work at Indiana University Libraries on the Avalon Media System project. And my talk today is called Pulling Weeds, Planting Seeds. It's about using pull requests to make changes. This talk is meant to just go through an overview of the process of pull requests and kind of demystify anything, because really pull requests are a tool for making changes of all kinds of things, not just code, and really anyone can do them. So thinking of Samvera as an ecosystem, we can take a look at my garden. This is my backyard garden. It's pretty unruly. There's some parts that are doing pretty well, some parts that aren't doing very well. You can see there's a bed that can not really be seen because it's just been neglected. And we have some code like that, right? That's hasn't been touched in a long time. Maybe the CI builds are failing. Dependencies are way out of date, and it's just a mess. We've got some beds in the back that are really underutilized. They could use some improvements, or maybe like think of code, like new features would really benefit it. Or there's the bed in the middle that's our tomatoes, and it's doing okay. It could use some weeding and some pruning. And the tool we have in GitHub to make any of these sorts of changes is the pull request. So GitHub's definition here is that a pull request is basically the way to announce to others that you've got a change you'd like to make, and have a conversation around it, have review of it, and then eventually merge that change into the code or into what's version controlled. So to note that if you use GitLab, this is called a merge request. So if you're making a contribution, you're getting started, you might kind of make a plan. So you have an idea for a new thing, find a bug. The first thing you can do is make an issue in GitHub and then get feedback on that. GitHub's the place for that conversation, but you can also take that conversation out to other communication channels, especially if you want to draw attention to it and get someone's feedback. So I thought, let's try this. Let's do this live. I was digging through some code or some documentation. This is a template for a documentation file that would go in a repository, and it hasn't been touched in a few years. And I see that there are these old wiki links that go to the DuraSpace wiki, which doesn't exist anymore. So let's start and let's file a ticket. I go to the issues tab. I can click new issue. And this still has my text saved. So I've typed in a title, a little bit of as much context as you can give is good. This one doesn't need too much. So I'm going to make a new issue. And here we have issue number 74. I'm going to save that for later. And so now we have an issue. We have, kind of like thinking of a plan of what changes might be. Now it's time to do the work and make the pull request. So you start by making a branch to work in. If you don't have commit privileges, this could be making a fork of the repository and making a branch there. GitHub's user interface makes this easy if you want to do that. Make your changes and commit them. If this is a code change, then you want to make sure to add tests and documentation as appropriate. Check those by running rspec and rubocop to check the style. And the key thing is just to make sure that your changes are really scoped to the issue that you're working on. If you are working on it and you find other things that are wrong and you really want to fix those, it's best to save those for another pull request and just have multiple small ones. If you're doing your code changes and you're running the tests and you have to iterate a lot and make lots of commits, then before you submit it as a pull request, it's good to squash those down to logical, kind of semantically independent commits that are more compact. Push your changes up to a branch and then open a pull request in GitHub. Brief title and as much context as you can add to the description is good. If it's something that's still kind of experimental and it's a work in progress, just make it as a draft PR and you can get feedback while you're still working on it. So again, let's do this. So here's this file. GitHub provides a nice little edit tool. And so I found where in the new wiki this information lies. So I'm going to replace this link and also this one down here. Try to avoid any typos. Don't need that anchor. And let's update this link label. Getting started in the Samvera community. Okay, looks good. Scrolling down, this is where the commit, I can make a commit message and say update wiki links to point to new Atlassian hosted wiki. And I'll make sure to make this as a branch and not commit it directly to the main branch, which might not even be allowed. So I'm going to click propose changes, and this will make that commit in a new branch. And once GitHub returns, we'll start the process of making the pull request. And let's say this fixes, oops, not this link, but that issue I created. So I'm giving that context to point back to the issue I made. And I'm just going to go ahead and make this. And here we go. Got pull request number 75. And then we'll take a look at what kind of the review process is. Once the pull request has been created, it goes through a review process. So despite running checks before you commit and push up, there might still be some issues in the code, maybe unintended side effects, some bugs, hence the picture of the brood cicadas that emerged this year. Automated checks will run, status checks will run on any code changes, just Rubocop, RSpec, Hound for JSLint, maybe some other checks. It varies per repository. If one of those fails and there's some issue, the submitter should fix those. And generally, code reviewers will see all those status checks being green, being passing, and then they'll look for a review. So a reviewer will come along and take a look, see if there's a signed contributor license agreement on file, check for backwards compatibility if that's important in the PR. Ask some questions, suggest improvements. When it's suggesting improvements, code reviewers should make sure to not expand the scope of the, of the PR, but instead keeping it focused on the changes that are there. So they shouldn't ask for more things to be done outside of it. And so there's a conversation, submitter will respond, reviewer will respond back, and eventually, come to a happy place and reviewer will approve it. And if a reviewer hasn't come along in a while, reach out. That's kind of a common thing here is throughout all of this, feel free to reach out in any communication channel to get help and get someone to review it. So I'm going to come back over here, check out my pull request, and no one's reviewed it yet. So I'm going to copy it into Slack and say, hey, could someone please review this pull request? And I hope someone will come along really quickly and review this because it's a real small, simple change. And hopefully someone will, once I can move on. So the next step is once it's approved, really anyone can merge it. In different repositories, I think there's different habits around this. I know in some cases, once it's approved, it's kind of maybe left for the submitter to go back and merge it in to do the final kind of piece of putting it in place. But really, if you see a pull request that's been approved, you should feel empowered to go ahead and merge it. It's a separate process for once something's in the code to then get it released into a gem that will be usable outside of the Git checkout. But I'm not going to go into that. This is kind of the rough process. Okay, some pro tips. Feel free to make a draft pull request and try to get feedback early. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to anyone through any medium there. During the Samvera tech call, we've tried to set aside time to do pull request review. So, if you have questions or just want a set of eyes on it, bring it to a tech call. It's been the kind of hopeful policy from the past to have reviewers be from a different Samvera partner institution, if possible, at least for core components, to try to make sure that the knowledge is spread across institutions. Sometimes status checks, particularly Circle CI, will just fail randomly. That can be really discouraging. Take a look, see if you can fix it. If not, put a comment in the pull request, reach out for help. This often happens with either flaky tests or with dependencies that have been updated and broken stuff out of the blue. It's always good housekeeping to delete off your branch after things are merged, unless if you have a need to keep it around. And pull requests are conversations where it should hopefully be a place for the reviewer and the submitter to both learn. So trying to underscore that all contributions are welcome and all reviewers are welcome. If you want to review, particularly in an approval role, you need to have commit privileges on the repository, and there's not really like an exclusive club for this. If you want to reach out and ask in like the dev channel on Slack, and you can get added to the committers team within GitHub. Here's some very documentation with talking about PRs, but the last link is a great blog post that came up in discussions in Slack a few years ago about what's good code review culture, what's not good code review culture. I recommend checking that one out. And as I said, everyone, be in touch and reach out. We all work on this together. Pull requests are a tool for anyone to use, documentation or code, and together we make this stuff better. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was incredible to go from an issue to a merge in your lightning talk. Well done. We're just over time. Thank you everyone so much for joining us for the last day of Samvera Connect. We'll be sending out a post-conference survey. We'd love your feedback. We'll be able to use it even at the virtual Connect that we'll have in the spring. So thank you so much. And we'll